Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and welcome back to SRPG Sapphics, the series where I take a deep dive into everything queer in Fire Emblem. The series has been on a bit of an extended hiatus because I'm running kind of low on topics, but I figured there's no better time to bring it back than Pride Month. So I asked my patrons to vote on which gay topic I should talk about, and it looks like I'm going to be starting some Three Houses discourse. Well, it's not going to get any easier if I put it off, so let's dive into this mess. I think Fodlan should have been more homophobic. I know how crazy that sounds, but let me explain myself. Because, on the one hand, I do like just how queer the cast of Three Houses is. For the majority of the Fire Emblem series, gay people were either excluded or left to the subtext, and even in Fates, when there were canonical queer characters, they resembled stereotypes and were handled very poorly. So the fact that Three Houses features so many bisexual characters, as well as making them all fully fleshed out beings instead of someone who is purely defined by their sexuality, is pretty undeniably a good thing. And Mercedes is my favorite character in the series, in part because her bisexuality is not front and center. Instead, it is a core part of a fully developed character. Three Houses also was bold enough to make one of its main lords, Edelgard, into a queer woman. And while she is a somewhat controversial character, I do find it pretty hard to deny that as a sapphic woman in a leading role, this is a step forward for the Fire Emblem franchise, regardless of what you think about Edelgard's other actions. Don't get me wrong, it's not that there's nothing to criticize about this representation. In particular, at launch, the emphasis on sapphic relationships to the erasure of MLM ones was pretty eyebrow-raising to say the least. And a large number of these relationships also come with the baggage of being teacher-student romances, which is its own can of worms I don't really feel like unpacking in this video. Instead, I want to focus on a glaring omission in the world building of Fodlan. Most of Fodlan's society is structured around crests, which are a genetically passed down attribute that people can have to allow them to wield holy weapons, and indicate that the crest wielder is a descendant of one of the 10 elites or the 4 saints. Or at least that's what we're told. We know some amount of the information we get about crests is incorrect just because of the propaganda campaign from the Church of Saros. For example, the DLC shows us that they were covering up the existence of the Apostates' crests, and the Saints' crests have a spoilery twist behind them as well. The Crest of Earnest, which Anna has, is also a whole can of worms, although this is probably just an Easter egg because Anna. And the Crest of Flames is something that the plot story revolves around, so again, for spoiler reasons, I don't want to dive into it. What's important isn't the exact specifics of how crests work, but instead the fact that the majority of Fodlan's population, including their elites, believe that having a crest makes you superior to someone who doesn't have one. While initially the crests and the nobility kind of overlapped, nowadays there are both families with crests that have fallen onto hard times and noble families that do not have a crest of their own. Yet because of this belief of crest bearers being superior to non-crest bearers, many noble families are seeking to arrange marriages in order to have a child that has a crest, or a high chance of having a crest. It's for this reason that oftentimes non-crest children are cast out of their families, as happened with the Gautier family. And those families who are lucky enough to have children with crests often try to marry them off in order to gain financial favor. In fact, this is something that we the player see firsthand in the side stories relating to Mercedes and Ingrid. One of Ingrid's primary story arcs revolves around her not wanting to get married, yet her father insisting that she do so because she has a crest. Ingrid's family, House Daphne, has fallen on very rough financial times, and they believe that by arranging her to marry into a rich family who desires to have a crest to add to their lineage, they can get a huge economic windfall and recover for themselves. This pressure would be enough on its own, but it is also worth noting that Ingrid's crest has recently re-emerged from a prolonged period of dormancy, and if she doesn't pass it down to a child, then it's not known when we will next get the Crest of Daphne. It could be centuries from now, for all we can tell. Because of that, there is an abundance of pressure for Ingrid to marry against her will, and not only that, but specifically marry a rich suitor picked out by her father. In fact, that is what her paralogue is about. Ingrid's father has arranged for her to get married without her knowledge, and the gang actually has to investigate and find evidence of his crimes in order to get the marriage called off. This shows just how ironclad these arranged marriages can be. Not only is Ingrid not wanting to marry this noble not enough, but the fact that she doesn't want to marry at all isn't even considered an option. And in fact, despite Ingrid's subplot, almost every single paired ending she has results in her getting married. The only exception is Dedue because she's racist against the people of Duscur, and this is the worst series ever. Ingrid's whole ordeal with marriage isn't an isolated situation either, because a similar subplot plays out with Mercedes. Mercedes herself has a very tragic backstory with a series of traumatic incidents that happened before the events of Three Houses. If you're curious about that, and why she's my favorite character in the cast, and probably all of FE, there is a video linked below that is a Mercedes character analysis. But for our purposes, the most important thing is that she, like Ingrid, has a crest, and her adoptive father wants to marry her off for his own financial gain. He's in a much less sympathetic position than Ingrid's had because he only adopted Mercedes and married her mother so that he could marry her off for his own profits as a merchant. But it shows yet another example of arranged marriage being used as a profitable enterprise because of the prospects of bearing a crest child. And the fact that these arranged marriages are specifically for the purpose of having offspring means that by necessity they must be between members of the opposite sex. And in theory, you could say that these characters being forced into heterosexual relationships, especially Mercedes, who is canonically bi, is a form of homophobia. But honestly, I don't really see it that way. The primary issue with these arranged marriages is that the women don't want to be in them. It doesn't matter that it's specifically to a man, it's the fact that it's forced that's bad. But this does beg the question. If the nobility is so obsessed with passing down crests to the point that they're willing to accept these arranged marriages, and it seems like they're fairly commonplace, why then doesn't Fodlan society place an importance on heterosexual couples? Or at least heterosexual couples within the nobility or within crest bearers. But despite covering the negative impacts of the crest system in multiple different avenues of life, there is not a single offhanded mention of how the crest system is kind of bad for queer rights. And this issue becomes even more glaring if we take a look at the canonically queer characters in Three Houses. I haven't really played that much with DLC, so I'm going to focus on the four main story ones, those being Edelgard, Dorothea, Mercedes, and Linhardt. I already talked about how the crests negatively impact Mercedes through arranged marriages, but it's worth noting that at multiple points she talks about how she wishes she was born without a crest, just a regular old commoner, so that she could be as involved in the church as she wishes she was. Considering she has multiple paired endings with other women, it feels like it would only naturally slot in that she also wishes she didn't have a crest so that she wouldn't be forced to marry a man. In a similar but kind of inverse situation is Dorothea, who spends much of her time at the academy being incredibly flirtatious since she's trying to marry out of poverty and into riches. And this subplot is constantly referred to as her husband hunt, specifically looking for a male spouse. It's not specified why, and it sticks out as a little bit odd thanks to the fact that Dorothea is canonically bisexual, but could very easily be explained with a simple throwaway line where she states that she's going for a husband because that's how you can get a crest baby, and thus marrying a rich woman wouldn't be as easy or lucrative for her. The base game's sole male queer character, Linhardt, also has a close relationship to crests, since they are his autistic special interest. As a queer man who is studying crests, and in particular looks into the way in which crests are passed down throughout the generations, you would think that the topic of crest obsession resulting in the favoring of heteronormative relationships would come up, even just in an offhanded remark. Much like with Dorothea, it doesn't feel like the sort of thing that would make an entire plotline on its own, but honestly, I think that's better representation. I don't want a character whose only trait is being queer. I want their queerness to feel like a natural extension of them that subtly impacts various parts of their life, but not all parts of their life, only showing up where it feels natural. And that brings us to Edelgard, by far the most plot-relevant of the queer characters, since she's one of the 3 main lords, and in 3 out of 4 routes, the primary antagonist. Edelgard's whole deal is that she wants to completely abolish the crest system, in part because of the way that it caused her siblings to die and her to get tortured and all this trauma, and in part because of the way the system unfairly impacts other people. She's seen the horrors that fall upon crestless people like Miklon, and the way that those with crests are also subjugated by the system. And even though she is in a position of power as someone who has a crest and is the Emperor of Adrestia, she wants to use that position of privilege to change the world in a way that she thinks will help others. But I think her struggle would feel a lot more personal if she or the narrative acknowledged the ways in which the crest system does impact someone even as privileged as her. I mean, it already touched on it a bit with the way that she was experimented on and all of her siblings died thanks to the crest system. But since this happens from those who slither in the dark, it feels more like an isolated incident than something inherent to society that Edelgard is trying to change. Meanwhile, if we had an offhanded line about how even someone as privileged as me can't even dare of marrying a girl, it would really help to sell Edelgard's stakes in this conflict. Now, I don't necessarily believe that all 4 of these characters need to have an interaction with homophobia in part of their character arc, nor do I think that their queerness should be the only character trait that manifests in them. Quite the contrary, I think that it feels more natural if queerness is just part of an overall complex and deep character who has other motivations and whatnot. But the seeming absence of any thought into how queerness would manifest in this world they've created really makes it feel like the characters aren't fully bisexual, but instead player-sexual, with their romantic feelings only existing for the purposes of the dating sim element of 3 houses. Like, we have canonically queer characters existing in a system that would be incentivized to oppress queerness, and the closest we get to any sort of acknowledgement of this is a Fire Emblem Heroes voice line where Shamir explains to Catherine that women marrying each other is more common on Dagda than it is in Fodlan. It just feels like really patronizing and shallow representation for what is otherwise one of the most deeply developed worlds in the Fire Emblem franchise. There is one factor that I think could have exacerbated the hesitation to flesh out homophobia around crests, and that is the fact that the crest system is propagandized by the Church of Seiros, a religious institution that has a lot of parallels with real-world Christianity. Like, they flipped the genders on the god and the pope, but you still have stuff like saints and saintly days, a choir. There's a lot of imagery that feels like it alludes to real-world Christianity. Thus, linking homophobia indirectly to the Church of Seiros would feel like a commentary on the often homophobic practices of certain sects of Christianity. But despite the potential for controversy with this choice, I think that it could have been ground for exploring how queerness and religion can interact when the tenets of a religion are opposed to queerness as a whole. Full disclosure, I personally am not religious, but I know plenty of queer friends who are. And I think the representation of a gay person finding acceptance and fellowship within the church could have been a meaningful and interesting concept to explore. Heck, Mercedes would be the perfect template for this because she already has the issue where she wishes she didn't have a crest and kinda hates the crest system, but at the same time balances that with her own religiousness. If handled well, this could have shown how it's possible to reject hateful teachings while not outright throwing out religion altogether. I don't know, I think there's fertile ground for some interesting stuff there, but unfortunately that's not the world we live in. So instead, I find myself just disappointed in how surface level the representation in Three Houses really is. It's better than Fate's, but that's a low bar. As I mentioned earlier, this video topic was voted on by my patrons. So, thank you to Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville, the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, I Like Rattata, Henry Fent, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Anna Cabana, Some Trades, The Daily Fugle, Faye, Magic Bite, Sardonic Muse, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, Adele, Controlled Aegis, Roman Chromantic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, Bonsi and Dave, SUP, Caius Cole, Histiclop, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Carrier Has Left, Calamity Callie, They Thumb, A Clever Username of Lies, Jackson McMahon, Kevin Hart Clawpose, Tailored Muffin, Andu, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Your Doctor, Seren Girlixie, Girlboss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Mary McLean, Jaden, Reflect, Elaine Provaste, Guigi555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Hound Dogs, and especially my Jagans, Thick Molder, Big Liability, Alexander Roper, Siggy, and Hypefish. The generous support of viewers like you are what makes these videos possible. If you can afford to do so, please consider donating as little as $3 a month to get your names in the credits, as well as early access to other videos. Right now, the next SRPG Sapphics video is available to my patrons. It's going to be an examination of the fan favorite ship of Lynn and Florina, which was the second place result on the poll that I ran earlier this month. None of the other options came particularly close to Crests or Lynn x Florina, so I decided I would do both of those videos, but do the Crest one first since it technically won the poll. That way, as many people as possible can feel like their votes counted. But that's enough rambling about that. Regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.